The bird said the dead man's name 3 days after the funeral, and nobody in the room could explain it. It came out of nowhere, the way the most devastating things always do. One moment the house was quiet with that particular grief-soaked silence that settles into old walls after a burial, and the next, from the corner of the living room where the African gray parrot sat in his cage beside the window, came a voice. Not a squawk, not a screech. A voice, low, unhurried, carrying the faint warmth of someone speaking in another room. The bird said the name the way only one person had ever said it, with that particular lilting emphasis on the second syllable, drawing it out the way someone does when they are calling a person they love back to them across a yard or a kitchen or a long stretch of afternoon. The grandmother did not flinch. She was the only one who did not flinch. She sat in her chair by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea she had forgotten to drink, and she looked at the bird with an expression that nobody in that room had the vocabulary to describe. Not surprise, not grief. Something quieter and older than either of those things. Something that looked almost like recognition. Her granddaughter Sowers was the one who said, out loud, what everyone else was only thinking. She said that it was just a thing the bird had learned. She said it must have heard the name being spoken around the house for years. She said there was a rational explanation. She said all the things that frightened people say when something small and undeniable punctures the story they have been telling themselves. The grandmother looked at her granddaughter and said very calmly that the parrot remembered everything. Nobody believed her. Not then. That would change. Sowers had not been back to the house in 4 years. 4 years is a long time in any life, but in her family it had been something closer to a sentence, a stretch of deliberate absence that she had dressed up in the language of busy schedules and long distances and the ordinary complications of adult life. She lived in Edinburgh now, a fact that had seemed practical and exciting when she first moved at 26, and had slowly become something she used as a buffer, a reason, a thing to point to when the real explanation was too uncomfortable to say directly. The real explanation was her grandfather Cormac. Not that he had done something terrible to her, or not in the ways people sometimes assume when a woman keeps her distance from family. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than that. Cormac had been the kind of man whose love felt like weather, powerful and present when it was warm, and capable of dropping into something cold and gray without warning. He had never raised a hand to anyone in that house, but he had raised his voice. He had raised the temperature of a room by walking into it. He had been capable of silences that lasted weeks, during which everyone in the house walked carefully, spoke gently, tried not to make themselves the thing that caused another day of cold weather. Sowers had loved him anyway. That was the part she could not explain to people who had not grown up in that particular emotional climate. You love what you grow up inside of. You learn the shape of it. You miss it even as you flee it. When her mother had called to say that Cormac was gone, that he had died in the night the way some old men do, quietly and without warning, Sowers had sat on the edge of her bed in Edinburgh and waited for herself to cry. The tears came, eventually. But what came first, and what frightened her most, was a complicated, guilty rush of something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. She had carried that feeling on the flight home. She carried it in the taxi from the airport, watching the familiar countryside unroll itself outside the window. She carried it up the path to the house, where the hydrangeas her grandmother Roisin had planted 15 years ago were just beginning to bloom, pale blue and quiet in the morning light. And then she walked through the door and heard the bird, and something shifted in her chest that she could not name. The parrot's name was Prospero. He was 31 years old, which made him older than Sowers by 3 years. African gray parrots can live for 50 years or more, a fact that Roisin had mentioned so many times over the years that it had become a kind of family joke, a gentle ongoing reference to the uncomfortable possibility that Prospero might outlive everyone in that house. including the people who found him unsettling. There were people who found him unsettling. Cormac had been one of them, though he had never said so directly. What he said, usually when Prospero did something that irritated him, was that the bird was unnatural, that there was something wrong with the creature that talked without understanding what it was saying, that it was a kind of mimicry that bordered on mockery, and that he had never been entirely comfortable with it. This opinion had not stopped him from talking in front of the bird, which was either a testament to his stubbornness or his forgetfulness, and possibly both. Roisin had owned Prospero since before she married Cormac. She had bought him from a woman in Kilkenny who was moving abroad and could not take him. And she had been 24 years old, unmarried, working at a post office and living in a flat above a bakery. And something about the bird's enormous dark eyes and the way he tilted his head when she spoke had undone her completely. She had named him after the sorcerer in the Shakespeare play, which everyone found either charming or pretentious, depending on who you asked. And she had spent the next 5 decades talking to him. This was important. This was, as it turned out, more important than anyone had understood. Because Roisin talked to Prospero the way some people talk to God, and some people talk to diaries, and some people never talk to anyone. She talked to him in the mornings while she made tea, and in the evenings while she watched the light change in the garden, and late at night when the house was sleeping and she was the only one still awake, the way she had always been the only one still awake, because Roisin had not slept properly in decades and had long since stopped expecting to. She talked to him about her children and her worries and her memories. She talked to him about things she could not say to Cormac, and things she could not say to her daughter Orla, who was Sours's mother, and things she could not say to anyone in that house, without the saying of them changing something irrevocably. She talked to Prospero because Prospero listened, which was something she had always needed more of than she had been given, and because she had understood early in their relationship that he would remember. Not everything. Not with comprehension or context, or any of the things that make memory meaningful to a human being, but he would hold on to things, a tone, a rhythm, a word that had been said with weight. He had a particular sensitivity to emotion, the way African greys often do, and he seemed to understand, in whatever way a bird understands anything, that some things were said differently from others. The family did not know all of this. They knew that Roisin loved the bird in the way that eccentric elderly women were supposed to love their pets, with a tenderness that seemed slightly excessive and occasionally embarrassing. They knew that he could talk, of course. Everyone knew he could talk. He had been talking for as long as any of them could remember, producing phrases and sounds in his dry, slightly hollow voice, and they had grown so accustomed to his commentary that they mostly stopped hearing it. That was the first mistake, the growing accustomed. The second mistake was assuming that what the bird said was random. Saura stayed at the house for the week following the funeral, because her mother needed her, and because the house needed people in it, and because she had not, when it came down to it, been able to bring herself to leave immediately the way some part of her had planned to. The house was the same house she had grown up visiting every school holiday, and it had the same smell of turf smoke and old books and the particular floral soap that Roisin had always used, and the sameness of it was both comforting and gutting in the way that only childhood places can be when you return to them after loss. She slept in the room she had always used as a child, the small one at the back of the house that looked out over the garden, where her grandmother had planted roses in every color she could find, and where the apple tree that Cormac had planted the year Saurs was born still stood in the corner, bigger now, more gnarled, still bearing fruit in October the way it always had. On the second night, she could not sleep. This was not unusual for her, the first nights in an unfamiliar bed after a difficult day. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the old wooden sounds of it, the way the wind came off the hills and pushed against the windows in a way that had always seemed to her like the house breathing. And then, from somewhere down the hall, she heard Prospero. She had assumed he would be quiet at night. She had assumed he was covered with his cloth, the way Roisin always covered him at bedtime, and that he was sleeping, and that she would not hear him until morning. She had assumed wrong. He was not speaking in words. He was making a sound that she could not immediately categorize, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to come and go with a pattern she almost recognized. She lay still and listened, and the longer she listened, the more certain she became that she was hearing something she should not be hearing, though she could not have said yet what it was. She got up. She moved down the hall in the darkness, navigating by memory and the faint light from the window at the end of the corridor, and she pushed open the living room door. Prospero's cage was still covered, the dark cloth draped over it the way Roisin always left it. The sound was still coming from beneath the cloth. Sour stood in the doorway of the dark room and listened, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to make out the words. He was saying something in a woman's voice, not his dry, slightly hollow parrot voice. He was doing what African greys sometimes do, what the good ones do, what Prospero did better than any bird Sours had ever heard of, which was modulating the quality of his imitation. He was producing something that sounded uncomfortably close to a woman speaking quietly in another room, and the voice he was producing was Roisin's voice, and the words were words that did not immediately make sense. Sours stood very still. She held her breath. Prospero said, in Roisin's voice, that she was sorry, that she had not meant for it to happen the way it did, that she had tried to tell him, and that he had not wanted to hear it, and that by the time she understood, he was never going to hear it. It was too late to undo what the silence had already built between them. Then there was a pause, and then the bird said, in a different voice, a voice Sours recognized, but could not immediately place, a man's voice, quieter and older than any voice she had ever heard Prospero use before. A single word. The word was a name. It was not Cormac's name. Sours turned on the light. Prospero went immediately quiet under his cloth, startled by the sudden brightness the way birds are startled by sudden things. From down the hall, she heard her grandmother's bedroom door open, and then Roisin appeared in the doorway of the living room, wearing her blue dressing gown, her white hair loose around her shoulders, looking at her granddaughter with an expression that carried no surprise at all. Roisin looked at the cage, and then at Sours, and she said quietly that she had wondered when this would happen. Sours asked her what the name was, the name the bird had said. She asked it carefully, the way you ask a question when you already suspect the answer is going to rearrange things. Roisin sat down in her chair. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the covered cage for a long moment, and she said that the name was Feargal, and that Feargal had been her son, and that he had died when he was 19 years old, and that nobody in this family had spoken his name properly in 43 years. Nobody had told Sours she had an uncle. This was the thing that would not leave her for the days that followed. Not the grief of it, not exactly, though that was there too. A strange displaced grief for a person she had never known existed, a grief without a specific shape. What would not leave her was the fact of the silence, the 43 years of it, the way that a person could be removed from the collective memory of a family, not by force or by conspiracy exactly, but by an agreement so gradual and so unspoken that by the end of it nobody could have said precisely when the decision had been made. Roisin talked that night. She talked in the way that people talk when they have been waiting a very long time, and the waiting is finally over, in long, unhurried sentences that move back and forth through time, picking up threads and following them, and setting them down and picking up others, the way memory works when it has been kept in the dark for decades and is suddenly allowed light. Feargal had been her firstborn. Before Orla, before the marriage to Cormac had settled into its long, complicated middle, There had been Feargal, who had been born when Roisin was 23 and not yet married, born in a way that was not spoken of in that time and that place, and who had been raised by Roisin's parents for the first 4 years of his life while she worked and saved and tried to figure out how to bring him home. When she brought him home, she had met Cormac, and Cormac had agreed to raise Feargal as his own, which was a generous thing, a remarkable thing, and for a long time it had worked, or it had seemed to work, and Feargal had been a real presence in that house, loud and funny and difficult in the way of certain teenage boys, with a laugh that Roisin described as too big for any room he was ever in. But there had been something that Feargal had known about himself from a young age, something about the way he was, the way he felt, the kind of person he was drawn toward, and in that time and that place, and in that house, with Cormac in it, there had been no safe way to name it. So Feargal had not named it. Not out loud. He had named it in letters that he wrote to his mother, and that she had kept in a box in the bottom of the wardrobe in her bedroom. Letters that Sowers would eventually read 3 days later with her hands shaking. Letters that were some of the most heartbreaking things she had ever encountered in her life. Written in a young man's handwriting, full of the particular language of someone trying to explain themselves to the person they love most and most fear losing. Roisin had written back. She had told him she loved him. She had tried to tell Cormac, had tried to begin the conversation twice, and both times Cormac had closed it before it could open, had shut down with that cold weather silence that meant the subject was not available, would not be available, was not to be raised again. Feargal had died in the spring of his 19th year. A road, a night, rain and a curve that he had taken too fast, or that had taken him. The official record said accident. Roisin had the official record memorized. She had also spent 43 years sitting with the question of whether it was only an accident, and she had never been able to answer it to her own satisfaction. And that unanswered question had lived in her chest like a stone all that time. After Feargal died, Cormac had initiated the silence. Not cruelly, not with any explicit command. He had simply stopped saying the name. He had packed away the photographs, most of them, though Roisin had kept some hidden in the wardrobe with the letters. He had redirected every conversation that moved toward Feargal, and gradually, over months and years, the people around him had learned the direction in which not to look, and then they had stopped looking there at all. And eventually, by the time Orla was old enough to ask questions, there was nothing left to ask questions about. Orla did not know she'd had a brother. She had been 3 when Feargal died, too young to hold the memory. Nobody had ever told her. Roisin had wanted to. She had wanted to many times. But Cormac had been so precise in his removal of Feargal from the living record of the family, so methodical in the way, he never said the name and never acknowledged the history, and simply proceeded with the version of events in which there had only ever been one child, that Roisin had come to understand, without it ever being explicitly stated, that telling Orla would be a kind of betrayal that Cormac would not survive. And she had, in the way of certain women of her generation, in the way of women who have been married to difficult men, and who love them despite and around and through the difficulty, she had chosen the marriage over the truth, and Feargal had remained unmourned. Or rather, he had been mourned in private, in the quiet of early mornings before Cormac was awake, in conversations with a parrot who listened without judgment, and who never told what he heard. Sowers sat in the kitchen after Roisin had gone to bed, and she held the mug of tea her grandmother had made her, and she tried to understand what she was feeling. It was not a single thing. It was the way that grief is often not a single thing, but a layered and complicated architecture of different losses all present at once. She was grieving Feargal, a young man she had never met. She was grieving the version of Roisin she thought she had known, who was more specific and more wounded than she had understood. She was grieving something for her mother, who was asleep upstairs, and did not yet know she'd had a brother. A grief on behalf of someone who had not yet begun to grieve. And she was feeling something about Cormac that she could not entirely resolve. Because Cormac was gone now, and the silence he had maintained for 43 years was therefore no longer something he could be confronted about. The man who had been capable of cold weather and long silences and the particular cruelty of erasure was now himself erased, or at least removed from the conversation in a permanent way, and Sowers found herself in the uncomfortable position of being angry at a man she could not reach. She thought about the Parrot. She thought about Prospero, who had been listening in the corner of rooms for 30 years, who had heard the things that were said in that house and the things that were not said, who had heard Roisin talking in the early morning and the late night, had heard her saying the things she could not say to any person living in that house, who had been, in some real and slightly devastating sense, the only one Roisin had been able to talk to. She thought about what the bird knew. 3 days after the funeral, and 2 days after that first night in the living room, Orla finally asked the question that had been gathering since Sowers told her what she had heard. Orla had received the information about Firgal with a stillness that was different from Cormac's cold weather stillness, a stillness that came from the inside rather than being imposed from the outside. A woman in her late 50s, sitting at her mother's kitchen table, going very quiet as she rearranged the furniture of her entire life in her head. She did not cry at first. She listened to everything Roisin told her, which took the better part of a morning, Roisin speaking slowly and carefully, and with a kind of courage that Sowers recognized as hard-won. She listened to everything, and then she went upstairs, and Sowers heard her crying through the floor, and she stayed downstairs with Roisin, and did not go up because she understood that Orla needed to do that part alone. When Orla came back downstairs, her face was changed. Not in a bad way. In the way that faces change when something that has been slightly wrong for a long time, something too subtle to name, is finally corrected. She looked at her mother, and she said that she had always known something was missing. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it as a statement of fact, the way you say something that you have known for a very long time, without knowing how you knew it or what it was. She said that she had always had the feeling, her whole life, that the family she was living inside was slightly smaller than it was supposed to be, that there was a shape missing, a voice, a presence that should have been there and was not. She had thought for years that this feeling was her own imagination, or her own emotional excess, or something generic about growing up in a large and quiet house. It had not been her imagination. Orla looked at the Parrot. Prospero was awake and alert on his perch, his enormous dark eyes moving between the people in the room with the particular focused attention that he gave to moments of emotional intensity, which was another thing about African greys, the way they seemed to tune into feeling. He said nothing for a moment, and then, without any prompting, in a voice that was neither Roisin's voice nor the man's voice from that first night, but something else, something younger and warmer, he said a phrase that Roisin went pale to hear. He said, in that younger voice, what had been apparently Firgal's habitual way of ending a conversation with his mother, a small private phrase, a term of endearment in Irish that meant something roughly translatable as I am going now, but I will come back to you. Roisin covered her mouth with both hands. Orla looked at her mother, and then at the bird, and then she said, very quietly, that she wished she had known him. Sowers stayed at the house for 3 more weeks. This was not what she had planned. She had booked a return flight for the Sunday after the funeral. She changed the flight, and then she changed it again, and eventually she stopped thinking about changing it and simply stayed. Edinburgh was not going anywhere. Her life that was not going anywhere. Her flat would be there when she got back, with its familiar rooms and its view over the street and its comfortable smallness, its useful distance. But she was not ready to leave yet. She began spending time with Prospero in the way that she had never thought to do before, sitting with him in the mornings while Roisin slept late, which she had begun doing since the funeral, as though something in her was finally allowing itself to rest. Sowers would sit in the armchair across from his cage with a cup of tea, and she would just be present, not trying to get him to speak, not testing him or analyzing him, just being in the same room. He talked anyway. He said things that she wrote down in a notebook she found in the kitchen drawer, partly because she wanted to remember them, and partly because she was trying to find the pattern in them, the logic of what he chose to say, and when and in which voice. She filled 7 pages in the first week. Some of it was ordinary, fragments of radio programs. Roisin asking him if he wanted water, weather observations, the sound of rain on the window, rendered as a kind of percussion he had developed for himself, the kettle boiling, which he did with an accuracy that had startled Sowers the first time she heard it, every pitch and phase of the thing. But some of it was not ordinary. Some of it was Cormac's voice. This surprised her. She had not expected to hear Cormac from the bird, or not in the way she heard him. She had expected maybe the gruff, cold weather version, the version that closed conversations, the version that had maintained 43 years of absence by sheer force of refusal. But what she heard instead, in the early mornings, was a different voice, a softer version. Cormac speaking to Roisin in a tone that Sowers had not known he possessed, quiet and tired and sad, saying things that suggested a man who carried more than he had shown anyone. One morning she heard Prospero reproduce what could only have been a conversation from some time in the middle of the night. Cormac's voice saying that he thought about the boy every day, and that he did not know how to say it, and Roisin's voice responding that she knew, and Cormac's voice saying that he had made everything worse, and that he did not know how to make it better, and that it was too late by then. It had been too late for a long time, and that the only thing he knew how to do anymore was hold on to what remained. Sowers did not move when she heard this. She sat very still and let the bird finish, which he did in the way of dreams, trailing off into an unrelated sound, a door closing somewhere in memory, and then silence. She did not know what to do with this. She did not know what to do with Cormac being both the person who had enforced the silence and also the person who had been broken by it in private, in the dark, in the hours when nobody was watching. She did not know how to hold both of those things at once, and she suspected that Roisin had been holding both of them for 43 years, and that this was perhaps the heaviest thing about Roisin's life, heavier even than the loss itself, the understanding that the man who had hurt her by refusing to speak had also been, in his own inarticulate way, shattered by the same loss, and that neither of them had been able to reach the other across it. She called her mother that evening and told her what she had heard. Orla was quiet for a long time. Then she said that it almost made it worse, that it was almost easier to be angry at a man who felt nothing than a man who felt too much and did not know what to do with it. Sowers said that she thought both things were true. Orla said that she needed to come over. She had been going back to her own house in Cork in the evenings, sleeping there, and driving back each morning, maintaining the rhythm of her ordinary life around the edges of this extraordinary week. But she said she needed to come and sit in that room with Roisin and the bird, and that she needed to do it soon. She came the next day. The 3 of them sat together in the living room that afternoon, Roisin and Orla and Sowers, with the afternoon light coming through the window in the way it always had, gold and slightly dusty, making everything in the room look like something from a long time ago. Prospero was awake and watching. He had the quality, on that particular afternoon, of a creature who understood the significance of what was happening, though Sowers told herself that was just the human tendency to assign meaning to the behavior of animals. Roisin brought out the box from the wardrobe, the letters. There were 31 of them, each one in a worn envelope with Roisin's name written on the front in a young man's handwriting that grew more certain and more clear across the years. She laid them on the table and did not immediately open them. Just let them be there, present and real, a young man's voice made physical. Orla picked up the one on top. She looked at the handwriting for a long time. She said that she could see Roisin in the way the letters were formed, the particular slope of certain characters, the way the capital R was made. She said that it was strange to see your own handwriting in someone else's hand. Roisin said that Feargal had always been more like her, that he had her hands and her tendency to talk too much when he was nervous, and her inability to sleep more than 5 hours, even when he was tired. She said these things with a smile that was one of the most complex expressions Sowers had ever seen on a human face, full of love and grief and the particular ache of remembering someone young. Orla asked if she could read them. Roisin said that they were hers, that they had always been hers, that Feargal had written them to her, but that they belonged now to the family, and that Orla and Sowers should read all of them, and that she hoped it would feel like meeting him, even a little. It did feel like meeting him. Sowers read them over the following days, taking them one or two at a time, sitting by the window in her room with the garden below her, and the apple tree in the corner, and the words of a young man who had died before she was born, slowly becoming real in her hands. He was funny, Feargal. Funnier than she had expected. He had the kind of humor that lives close to sadness, the kind you develop when you are intelligent and perceptive and living inside a situation that offers no obvious exit. He made jokes about things he was clearly frightened by. He was tender with Roisin in a way that felt adult and equal, more like a friendship than a parent-child dynamic. The way some relationships between mothers and children become when the child understands early that the mother is also a person. And he was honest in the later letters. Honest about what he was, about who he was, in language that had clearly cost him something to write. That had been worked over and revised before he committed it to the page. He talked about being afraid of his father's reaction, using the word father, though he must have known by then, or suspected, that Cormac was not his biological father. He talked about the particular loneliness of being the person in a family who does not fit the template the family has agreed on. He talked about loving the house and the hills around it, and the smell of the turf smoke and the sound of rain on the windows, and wanting very badly to be able to come home, and also being not entirely sure that home was available to him in the way it would need to be. The last letter was dated 6 weeks before he died. It was shorter than the others. It said that he had decided to stop being afraid, that he had made a decision, and that the decision felt right, even though it frightened him. That he was going to tell Cormac, or try to, over the Easter weekend when they would all be together. That whatever happened after that, he wanted Roisin to know that she was the best part of his life, that she was the reason he knew how to love people, and that nothing that happened was ever going to change what they were to each other. Sowers read that last letter 3 times. She held it carefully in both hands, as though it were a living thing. Outside the window, the apple tree moved slightly in the wind, and the garden was bright with afternoon light, and from down the hall she could hear, faintly, Prospero talking to Roisin. She went down the hall. Roisin was in the living room, sitting in her usual chair, and Prospero was on his perch with his cloth off, in the way of late afternoon when he was most talkative. Roisin looked up when Sowers came in, and she could see from Sowers's face that she had finished the letters, and she made a small gesture with her hand that was somewhere between welcome and acknowledgement. Sowers asked about the Easter weekend, the one Feargal had mentioned. She asked what had happened. Roisin was quiet for a long moment. Prospero shifted on his perch and said something low and indistinct that might have been a word and might have been a sound, and Roisin looked at him and then back at Sowers. She said that Feargal had arrived on the Thursday evening, that he had been quieter than usual, but not in a bad way, in a way that felt purposeful, like a person who has made up their mind about something and is simply waiting for the right moment. She said that the Friday had passed without anything happening, just an ordinary day. The four of them, Cormac and Roisin and Orla, who was 3 and toddling around underfoot, and Feargal, who was patient with his little sister in a way that made Roisin's heart very full. She said that on the Saturday morning, Feargal had asked Cormac to go for a walk with him, which was not unusual. They sometimes walked together on weekend mornings, out across the fields behind the house and up toward the low ridge of hills that you could see from the kitchen window on clear days. They had been gone for 2 hours. Cormac had come back alone. He had come into the kitchen, and he had not looked at Roisin, which was already a bad sign, and he had put the kettle on and stood with his back to her, and she had known immediately that something had happened, something that could not be undone, and she had waited, and the kettle had boiled, and he had made his tea, and he had still not turned around, and she had finally said his name. He had said that Feargal would not be coming back to the house. She had asked what he meant, though she already knew. He had said that Feargal had told him something, and that he had told Feargal what he thought about it, and that Feargal had left, and that he would not be back. He said this with his back to her, and in the voice that meant the conversation was finished, the cold weather voice, and Roisin had understood that she had a choice in that moment. She could push against it, which she had done before, and which had never worked, which had only resulted in longer silences and a colder house, and nothing changed. Or she could wait. She had waited. She had waited 2 days for Feargal to call or write or appear, and he had not. And then there had been the call from the police on the Monday morning, and after that there had been no more waiting to do. Sours was holding her breath. Roisin said, very quietly, that she had never been sure whether Feargal had left the house that morning, intending to come back eventually, or whether Cormac had said something so final that the coming back had become impossible. She said that Cormac had never told her what he said, that she had asked him in the years after, asked him directly and quietly and without accusation, and he had never answered, and that this was the thing she had lived with, the not knowing exactly what had been said on that hillside that had preceded everything else. She said that Cormac had known, that he had carried it, whatever it was, all those years, that this was perhaps why the silence had been so total and so maintained, because inside it was something he could not bear to let out. She said that she had been angry, that she had been furious, in the way that takes years to name itself properly, the slow-burning anger of someone who has been made to carry a grief alone when they deserved company in it. She had been angry, and she had stayed, because leaving had not seemed like a real option, and because there was Orla who needed her, and because, underneath everything, she had understood that Cormac was also drowning, that he was a man incapable of the kind of reckoning his actions required, and that he would carry what he had done to his own death without ever finding the language for it. Which is, she said, exactly what had happened. Prospero said something then. He said it in the voice he had used on that first night, the one Sours had not been able to place, the man's voice, quieter and older than any she had heard from him before. He said a single sentence. He said it the way you say something that has been unsaid for a very long time and is finally finding its way out. He said, in Cormac's voice, that he was sorry, that he had been wrong, that he had been a coward, and that Feargal had deserved better, and that he was sorry. The room was very still. Roisin looked at the bird for a long time. Her expression was the one Sours had first seen on the day she arrived, the one she had not had a word for, the thing that was older than surprise and older than grief. She looked at Prospero, and the tears ran down her face without any sound, in the quiet way of old grief that has finally been given permission. She said to the bird, to the room, to the air, that she had wondered for years whether he had ever felt it. The sorry. whether it had been in there somewhere. She said she had hoped it was, had needed to believe it was, and that she had never been given any reason to know. Sowers did not say anything. She sat across the room and watched her grandmother cry quietly in her chair, and she understood, in a way she had never fully understood before, what the bird was. What he had been all this time? Not a supernatural thing, not a magical thing, nothing outside the ordinary mechanics of a creature with an extraordinary capacity for memory and imitation, but a vessel, nonetheless. A vessel in which things had been deposited, over 30 years of early mornings and late nights, conversations held in the dark with someone who would listen without judgment and who would keep what he heard. Things that could not be said in the house as long as Cormac was living in it. Things that had waited. The sorry had been there. Roisin had been right. Cormac had said it at some point, possibly more than once, in the private hours when he believed no one was listening. But someone had been listening. Something had been listening. And it had remembered. In the days that followed, Sowers began thinking about things she had taken for granted her entire life. The silences in that family, the particular emotional weather of gatherings and holidays, and the way certain subjects were navigated around. She thought about her mother growing up in a house where a brother had been erased. She thought about the particular shape of Orla, who had always seemed to Sowers slightly braced, as though against something she could not see. A woman who was warm and capable, and good, but who had, all her life, a quality of guardedness that Sowers had always attributed to her father's temperament, and that she understood now was something else. It was the body's memory of an absence it could not name, a cellular awareness of a shape that was missing. She called her mother, and they talked for 2 hours. Orla told her things she had not said before, small memories from childhood that had never made sense to her and made sense now, details that had been too small to mention at the time, and that added up, assembled over the course of a long phone call, into something that felt important. A photograph she had found once in the wardrobe and asked about and been told was nobody important. A name she had seen on an envelope once, on the hall table, and asked about and been told was a mistake, wrong address. A question she had asked Cormac when she was 12, about whether she had any other siblings, and the particular way he had looked at her, not angry, not cold, just for a moment stripped of the maintenance of himself, before he had reassembled, and said no. Orla said that she thought that moment, that split second of assembly, had stayed with her for 50 years without her knowing why. She said she wished she had known to push. Sowers said that she did not think pushing would have changed anything. She said that some walls do not come down while the person on the other side of them is still present, that some things wait. She thought of Prospero. She thought of all those mornings, the patience of it. She found herself, in the final days of her extended stay, thinking about legacy in ways she had not thought about it before, about what it was that we passed on when we died, not deliberately, not in wills and last wishes, but the residue of who we had been, the things we said in the dark, the things we could not say, the people we hurt, and whether we knew it, whether we carried it, whether the carrying changed anything, or whether it only ever changed us. She thought about Cormac, who had said sorry in the early morning hours to a parrot, which was perhaps the most Cormac thing she could imagine, a man incapable of apology in the presence of anyone who could receive it, finding in the absence of witnesses the only place he could let the word exist. She thought about whether that counted, whether sorry counted when it was said where no one could hear it. She thought about Prospero, who had heard it. She thought about Roisin, who had now heard it. She thought that maybe, in the end, it counted after all, that maybe the mechanics of how it reached its destination mattered less than the fact that it had arrived. The morning she finally left, she went to say goodbye to Prospero. He was awake already, in the early light, his feathers settled and his dark eyes alert. She stood in front of his cage and looked at him for a moment, The way she had been looking at him for weeks now, not searching for something, not waiting for him to perform anything, just being present with him, the way she had learned to be over the course of this unexpected time. He looked back at her. He made a sound she had not heard him make before. A small, low sound that was not a word and not quite a bird sound. Something in between, something that felt almost deliberate in the way it settled into the air between them. Then he said, in Roisen's voice, the phrase he had used that night in the living room. The phrase that had made Roisen go pale, the one in Irish, the one that meant something close to "I'm going now, but I will come back to you." Sauer stood very still. She understood, in the way you understand things that are not entirely rational, and that you choose to let be true anyway, that the phrase was meant for her. That Prospero, who had no way of intending anything, who was a bird and not a spirit medium, who was the product of 30 years of absorbed language, and nothing more mystical than that, had nonetheless in this moment said the exact right thing. She put her hand against the cage, her fingers against the bars, the way she had seen Roisen do in the mornings. She said goodbye to him. She drove to the airport in a rental car through the early morning hills, through the light that was soft and gold the way it is in that part of the country in the autumn, and she carried the weight of everything she had learned over the past weeks carefully in her chest, the way you carry something fragile. She thought about Firgal, who had walked down a road one Monday morning and had not come home. She thought about the word he had used in his last letter, decided, that he had decided to stop being afraid. She thought about how much courage that must have taken, the particular courage of a young person deciding to be entirely themselves in the world, regardless of what it cost them, and how in his case it had not had time to pay off, how the outcome had been what it was before the decision could land properly. She thought about him as a real person, with real hands and a laugh that was too big for rooms, and a way of making jokes when he was frightened. And she felt the grief of him as a real grief, specific and aching, for a young man she had never met and would never meet, and who had nonetheless become, over the course of this impossible month, someone she felt she knew. She thought about Roisen, who had kept him alive in the only ways available to her. In letters, in the things she said to a bird in the early morning, in the refusal to let his name disappear entirely from her own mouth, even as it disappeared from every other. She thought about what it cost to love someone in secret for 43 years, to tend a grief that had no public form, to hold a person in memory when the formal mechanisms of memory, the photographs on walls, the stories told at gatherings, the ordinary commemorations that families perform, had all been stripped away. She thought about Roisen sitting in her chair with Prospero on 1,000 mornings, talking about a boy who had laughed too loud and written beautiful letters, and decided, once, to stop being afraid. She thought about Cormac. This was the hardest thinking. She thought about him without the benefit of being able to forgive him easily or hate him cleanly. Because he was neither of those things, he was the more difficult third thing. A man who had done harm and known it and been unable to repair it and carried it anyway, in the cold private interior of himself, saying sorry in the dark to no one. She thought about all the ways that people fail the people they love, and the ways that the failure is sometimes rooted in something that was done to them long before, some fear or wound or inherited inadequacy that they never had the tools to address. She did not use this to excuse him. She was not interested in excusing him, but she was interested in understanding him, because she was her grandmother's granddaughter, and Roisen had always been interested in understanding, even when understanding was painful and offered no comfort. She thought about what Roisen had said the night before, when they had sat together after Orla had left and the house had gone quiet. Roisen had said that she did not know whether to believe that Cormac's sorry had been real, or whether it had been the sorry of a man who was sorry for his own suffering rather than for the suffering he had caused. She said she did not know, and she had decided that she was going to stop needing to know, that the not knowing was part of what she had been left with, and that fighting it for another 43 years was not something she was willing to do. That she was going to put the letters back in the box and keep them in the wardrobe, and that Orla was going to take some of them home with her, and that at some point, when they were both ready, they were going to go together to wherever Feargal was buried and stand there for a while and say his name out loud in a field, and that this was going to be enough. Not everything, not a resolution, not the thing that made it all right, but enough. Sowers had looked at her grandmother across the kitchen table and had thought that Roisin was the strongest person she had ever known, in a way that had nothing to do with hardness or imperviousness, or any of the things that strength is usually associated with. She was strong in the way of old trees, which is to say, rooted so deeply and so long that weather becomes simply weather, something that happens and changes and moves on, while the thing at the center remains. At the airport, waiting for her flight, she took out the notebook she had been carrying for weeks, the one with the 7 pages of things Prospero had said. She read through it one more time. She was not sure yet what she was going to do with it, whether she would write something, whether she would tell anyone beyond the small circle of this family, whether any of this was a story that belonged to the world, or whether it was simply a story that belonged to 3 women in a house in the west of Ireland and a parrot who remembered everything. She thought about the phrase in Irish, "I am going now, but I will come back to you." It was a phrase that could belong to anyone. To Feargal leaving on a walk he did not come back from. To Cormac, gone to wherever people go when the weight of everything they could not say finally becomes too much. To Sowers herself, who was about to board a plane to Edinburgh, carrying more with her than she had arrived with, returning to her life slightly rearranged. She thought about what Roisin had said when she had first heard the phrase from Prospero, that first night in the living room, her white hair loose and her face in the lamplight. Roisin had said, after a long moment, that she believed it, that she believed Feargal had come back to her, not in any form that could be seen or touched, but in the way that the people we lose most deeply are always somehow coming back, in the things they taught us without knowing, in the habits we inherit from them, in the shapes that their absence cuts into us, which are also the shapes of who they were, and in 31 letters, in a box, in a wardrobe, and in a parrot 31 years old who had learned a phrase at some point in his long tenancy in that house, and who had kept it, in whatever way birds keep things, and said it at the moment when the right person needed to hear it. There was a woman sitting across from Sowers in the airport departure lounge, bouncing a small child on her knee, the child making the unself-conscious sounds of delight that very young children make. Sowers watched them without intending to, the way you watch the ordinary miraculous things when you have been living inside grief. The woman caught her looking and smiled. It was an uncomplicated smile, the smile of a stranger in a departure lounge, and Sowers smiled back, and it was a perfectly ordinary exchange, the kind that happens 1,000 times a day in airports all over the world, meaning nothing and everything simultaneously. She thought that Parrot remembered everything, and because he remembered, Roisin was not alone in it anymore. And because Roisin was not alone in it anymore, the silence was broken, and Feargal existed again in the full sense, not as an absence or a secret or a shape that should have been there and wasn't, but as a young man who had laughed too loudly and written beautiful letters and decided, once, with considerable courage, to stop being afraid. That was what the bird had done. Not magic, not miracle. Just memory, held faithfully and released at the right moment, the way memory does when it has been kept carefully enough and long enough. The flight was called. Sowers gathered her things and walked toward the gate, and the morning light came through the tall windows of the terminal in long slanted lines, gold and slightly dusty, the way light always came through windows in rooms where people had loved each other imperfectly and long. She would come back. She knew that she would come back. Not because of obligation or duty or any of the things that had made her stay away for 4 years, but because something had changed in the nature of what the house was to her. It had become larger. It had become more true. It held now not only the family she had known, but the larger and more real family that had always been there underneath, the one that included a young man with a loud laugh and beautiful handwriting, who had named a part of himself at 19 and had not had enough time for the naming to become a wife. She would come back. She would sit in the living room with Roisin. She would drink tea and watch the light in the garden and listen to the apple tree move in the wind. And Prospero would talk from his perch in the corner, in whatever voices he chose, on whatever morning he chose, and she would listen. Some of it would be ordinary. Some of it would be heartbreaking. Some of it she would recognize, and some of it would be beyond her. But she would listen, because the bird remembered everything, and as long as the bird was alive, the things that had been said in that house in the dark were not entirely gone. And because memory, even when it lives in the most unexpected vessel, is still the most human thing there is, the most stubborn, the most faithful, the most indestructible, the thing that survives the silence, the thing that survives the cold weather and the long years and the men who could not find the language and the grief that has no public form, the thing that says, in a voice you almost recognize, from a room just down the hall, I am going now, but I will come back to you.